history of museums, this history of the way in which the spaces that we work in, that many of us work in, have these roots in any number of colonial violences. And so for me, when I start thinking about the ways in which value is assigned, I sort of go back to linguistic terms and thinking about the language that we use to categorize and index things, but also the ways in which I sort of harken back to the Victorian era and think about how language was used to demarcate things on this binary system, using binary language in terms of light versus dark, good versus evil, and how that sort of filters through to the lenses through which we look at works in the institution. And I think about those histories, which I gave a very quick and brief sort of truncated version of that. I think about that in terms of how I move forward in the work that I do. So what I'm thinking about that work as someone who comes from a long line of people who have experienced various forms of colonization in different geographies, and how that culminates in the work that I do in this land that is now called Canada. So I think I'm going to leave that there for now, and then I'm going to come back perhaps at the end of everyone else's responses to this.
Dakota, would you like to take it?
Sally, I love that you bring up the binary, and I actually have that. I'd like to come back to that when we come to the second question as well, because this idea of good and bad and right and wrong also really comes into play. But I'm going to take this question in a little bit more simple format, and thinking about my own practice. I'm really I personally am often thinking about, like, how did we as Indigenous people place value on things, and how does that differ from the way a non-Indigenous audience places values on things? And sometimes that goes into my exploration of how artistic canons have been set up, and who got to establish them, and who got to assign what rose to the top of the hierarchy in artistic canons, and what didn't. And that comes especially into play in like Indigenous artwork, because when the Europeans came, that got relegated to this idea of craft, what they considered craft, which was based on what they considered women's work. And I like to flip that script, because, our regalia and the things that we were wearing and adorning ourselves with were really considered our high art, and our women were very honored for their abilities to make and create. And so these questions really relate to me into how I see that. And I think I have another slide. I'm showing the two slides that I'm showing are really related to our galleries and different ways of honoring. And in that first slide, you saw that we had very contemporary art, but we also showed something that might be considered historic to people who are non-Indigenous, because of the timing of when it was made, right? But one of the things we really tried to show in our galleries, and I was also very interested in showing, was like the continuum, that our contemporary artworks are based on these historic items. And that there isn't really a past and present and future artwork, and that we're abandoning something, but we're carrying all of these things forward and allowing people to express themselves in the way that they are inclined, whether they're in contemporary painting or still doing these customary arts. And I like to argue that both are significant and important for the future of our peoples. And I know we're keeping this to 3 minutes, so I just want to say, Something we can maybe talk on later is also like this idea of value and what is valued in the art world, and how something was established as being valuable. And so that all plays into these hierarchies, and how the canons were established with, like, you know, in the European way with paintings coming to the top. Right. So it's also not just about, but sometimes for us, the value is in who was supporting the community the most. And so there's just many ways to tease out different threads from that question. Thank you. Anisha.
Sorry. I want to just take a step back and looking at what colonial cartographies had at its core, and to really, you know, that fundamentally it was about reordering and reconfiguring space and relationships and all of that. And the fact that these very often, most often arbitrary demarcations positioned, you know, to create these lines which became ruptures, which kind of cut across historical social units, cut across, you know, cultural units, and began to create these differences, which led to many binaries. The other aspect that I'm interested to just address is the idea of the line, and the example of a river really comes to mind, where on a map, you know, which really we know has origins from that whole era, the line that demarcates the river basically it does not address the shifting, receding lines of the floodplain. So really to address the idea of value as being the possibility of the removal of these lines and borders to rediscover networks and you know, sort of links that enable us to you know, look at the ecosystem of what is represented rather than the objectification. And you know, so I think the bird's eye view versus the immersion in community. And I think that's where you know, the value kind of moves, you know, needs to move. So yes, I'll rest there.
Nisha, you had another slide. Did I miss it?
No problem. Yes, I had another slide. Yes, the next one. Yes, and I just wanted to address this aspect of the paradigmatic shift that's needed to move from the idea of subjugation to gratitude and exotic to equal, which really touches the human chord everywhere. I had one more slide, Heather, please. And there is this Indian poet, you know, who in the 80s sort of raised this rhetorical question, which turned the whole interest in modernism in some of the institutions on its head. And of course, every way that you ask the question when you're addressing a curation of some sort, you come up with actually different answers, and that's very interesting because it really explores and expands and explodes that whole subject area quite beautifully. And he started by saying, "Is there an Indian way of thinking?" So yes.
Well, I think everybody has kind of raised up this point that there are multiple ways to approach this question of value. And I wonder, we have a few more minutes to fill out the time on this topic. And I wonder if we can think through, like, one of the things, Dakota, that we've talked about before has been like, yes, there are these like the canon, right, which rests within these Eurocentric values. And let's maybe, I think, come back to points that have been made by multiple of you and think about what's the replacement of that, right? Like, what is the, if we were centering our various cultural perspectives, what are the things that might be elevated? Because there's always going to be hierarchies. It's sort of inherent within humanity to have hierarchies that order us, sequence us, create power structures. Those power structures don't necessarily have to be in the same hierarchy that we have with Western culture. But I think for a lot of people, the question would be like, what else is there? And I would suggest that like this poem, which I think is a perfect visual, especially when you, with the emphasis on those words, so that if you read down the larger words, it says, is an Indian thinking. And I think about this very specifically, Nisha, in the way that, you know, your continent, our continent, like we're all, you know, sort of homogenized into the term Indian, which is so damaging to the distinctiveness of our cultures. So maybe could you each maybe make a suggestion of some of the things that might be valuable of switching up those hierarchies, and how would those new hierarchies be constructed of what's most important? I know Heather Igloliorte in Canada has spoken to this as far as like thinking from an Inuit-centered perspective. What are the new boxes that would be created out of this exploration? And I don't know who wants to go first, so I jump in, somebody.
Well,
Yeah, go ahead, Dakota.
no, you go ahead, Nisha.
Yes. Heather, to me, I think your question really leads on to this whole idea of critical thinking, which I know you're going to address shortly. But I think to me, that's vital, because every subject and everything that we're trying to do really needs to be critically looked at, because to me, that's the tool. That's the big tool, you know? And every one of those questions may evoke a completely different response. There may be some common, you know, ways of doing things that may be patterns and prototypes. But between that, there's going to be just the richness of the whole culture, you know, and the expanding of that, and the bringing cognizance to that, I think is going to need us to don, you know, a critical hat. And the curator, therefore, has a huge role to play in that, a sensitive, reflective role, and also a hard look back to look at a situation critically.
I was just thinking of if we as curators are really helping to lay the groundwork to foster a respect for the who. And by that, I mean for the who of who gets to establish these hierarchies, because, you know, as having these individual social structures, different things were raising to the top in importance based on how these social structures developed, and just learning to develop a respect as an outsider for the fact that, okay, this people group has a social structure that is, I mean, I love to go to Nisha's previous slide, that is not about exotic but equal. So it's really turns that lens from one of you know, from looking up to looking down to what's going, to just like looking back and forth and having this reciprocal exchange. And that happens through developing and setting these, laying this groundwork for a mutual respect.
Sally, do you want to jump in here at all?
One of the things that I keep going back and forth with is whether it's possible to do what it is that we're sort of speaking around within the structure of museums and galleries. And I keep going back and forth because I think about the fact that, you know, maybe 40 years ago, this panel wouldn't be happening. And some of us who are on this call wouldn't be working in the spaces that we are currently in. We wouldn't be holding the positions that we hold. We wouldn't necessarily be able to move forward with some of the modes of inquiry that we raise. We wouldn't necessarily be able to showcase some of the artists who we work with, or even the types of works. And so, Dakota, you were speaking about how a lot of, I'm going to paraphrase what you were saying because you didn't necessarily use this language, things that are either viewed as an artifact, like where is that line between what is viewed as an artifact and what is an artwork? But again, to come back to that, I'm sort of like, I'm looking at my notes from our earlier conversation, and I talked about working like within the belly of the beast, working within the institution. So I think I'm wondering if it is possible for this sort of radical reimagining to take place within museological spaces that would allow for a truly decolonized, say, curatorial practice. What does that look like? And is that possible within these spaces with the histories that we're attached to and the experiences that we all are moving through and stem from?
You know, it's funny you say that, Sally, because I know that when we were working on getting FAM open, there was a period when we were we only had from 2018 to 2021 to prepare 26,000 square feet of gallery space and representing 39 tribes. There was every element of what could have been excused as impossible. And we could have at any moment used the term that it just couldn't be done and just come up with a different format. But there was this moment when we were supposed to start, everybody knows the pandemic set in March of 2020. We had scheduled our media production for 29 media production pieces that were scheduled in the gallery. The production to start in March of 2020 or April of 2020. And so April comes along and we're like, well, maybe this will pass. Let's give it a couple of weeks. Let's just see if it'll lift. And by June, we were sitting around the table and the media team was, saying, we can't do this. It's just impossible. None of us, myself included, wanted to put any of our elders, our revered elders, at risk because of, this sense of like, museums are often associated with a sense of greed. And I think that's fair. It's a fair assessment that we would want our exhibits to happen no matter what the risks were. But that was not really what we wanted. And it wasn't what we were being asked. And so, to your point, what I responded to our media team at that time was, we can't look at what impossibilities that we create because it's going to be hard. What I need you to come back with is a plan of how it can be done. And let's stop thinking about what can't be done and let's create new avenues to make it possible. And 2 weeks later, the team came and they had come up with a whole plan for using a remote control mechanism that they had located for the cameras to be in the room with the subject. The interview subjects were never in a room with anybody. We had our director and our producers in one room. We had our tech people in a different room, and we mitigated every risk. And we did 67 interviews with our revered, beloved elders, and not a single person got sick because of it, because we believed it was possible rather than thinking it wasn't. So I think that's my thought to what you said. But I do think that the idea of decolonizing is nevertheless a process, not necessarily a goal in and of itself, but really more about a process. And I think let's think about what that process is. And some of that comes from the question that we have prepared, which is, how can museums benefit from using critical analysis grounded in non-Western cultural paradigms? And Dakota, if it's okay, I'd like to go to you first, and I'll go ahead and move along to the slides you've sent.
Yeah, and I'll respond to this question, but I also want to say in response to Sally's question, which is a really important question, and it is one that, we can get stymied on, but to your very important point, Sally, 40 years ago, none of us would have been here. Right. So it's a kind of like getting back to Nisha's thing, like, maybe we have to look at the bird's eye view. When we were talking, when the four of us were talking, and the audience doesn't know this, but we were kind of joking, like, what do you want to do? And we all kind of said, yeah, we want to change the world, but like with one PowerPoint at a time, but I really think like that is how the world gets changed. Right. And so I know it can get discouraging at times, but also I think people like us are laying the groundwork, and we can't imagine, our ancestors could not imagine we would be here at this moment, considering all that we were suffering. But they still believed we would be here at this moment. And so I think those are, some fine differences. But in response to this question, I want to say, going back to, sorry, can we go back to the question? Because I got to see how my answer fit into that. Using critical analysis grounded in non-Western cultural paradigms. And again, if we move forward to this slide, this kind of ties into, these understanding that these different ways of knowing are equally valuable. And so one place where I see a disconnect often within museology is that this idea that all knowledge is necessary and knowing all is valuable. And I think, coming into this museum field and recognizing that that's, again, not how all societies are structured, right? And a lot of times within Indigenous communities, not everything is meant for everyone to know. And so coming back to this idea of respecting that way that a social infrastructure is set up and learning to be happy and satisfied within working within those paradigms is also important. And so this slide is really showing, we had some at our museum, had some visitors from Acoma Pueblo coming in to analyze these textiles. But there were often times where they would tell us, like this, what we're going to discuss next is not for you. And so we as a team, would leave the room so that they could have their time alone with these textiles, knowing that they, for this group, these textiles were speaking with them and communing with them in ways that we as museum professionals may or may not understand. And it really wasn't for us to know. And even though I'm Indigenous, I'm Lakota. So a lot of things that they are doing I don't also understand. It's not a matter of, like all Native people are getting that same knowledge base, or our cultures are set up the same. And if we go on to the next slide, I believe, here, one of the concepts within my nation, and I think for a lot of Indigenous people, is this idea of consensus. So when we're thinking about ways that things may differ, or just being open to different ways of seeing the world, this can also bring a great understanding to the museum field. Like, for instance, I heard it from an elder one time said, like, nobody got all the knowledge because that way the creator made sure we all had to work together. I don't know, had you heard that too, Heather? So this idea of consensus, in this mainstream world, we're operating under this idea of democracy, but if 51 win, that still means 49 are torqued off. Where if we're working towards consensus, that's where these great ideas bubble up. It's where that rub is. And so I just I'm showing a picture of at our museum, we developed this homeland section to really pay tribute to the people whose land our museum sits on. And even as an institution, we heard things that were really mind-opening through coming to consensus with these three different people groups on what this space could look like. So those are ways that I feel like, thinking critically and looking at and appreciating these other ways of knowing and these other ways of being can really bring you as a museum or a museum professional to a new level that you didn't even know existed.
Yes. So we talked about this earlier, but I was just thinking that could storytelling be an adequate replacement for the idea of the map, which is a construct of a colonial era and that way of thinking. And basically then you move between, the idea of the line, the boundary, something that is established as, the foundation on which everything else is based, and you move to really looking at life as lived. You move to sort of touching on, the pulse of the people being represented. So really, between the lines, also looking at appropriations as an outcome of having been a part of a system. What do appropriations of another system tell us about how people are responding to it? And of course, critical analysis versus romanticization. And I think that's very important because in making something exotic, we are basically saying you are the other, and it's an unequal position and a posture. And basically then is the root, of binaries coming into, the way that one perceives things. So the other is that any binary, I mean, I was just thinking about this morning, that any binary, whether you say civilized, exotic, or civilized, uncivilized, or spectacle versus, is really from the posture of the long distance gaze. And therefore it stays as a bird's eye view. And if that narration stops right there, then basically, and we're not allowing it to move into the act of storytelling, then we're still within the borders of the traditional museum typology. So how does one move from empirical data-based representation of material culture and its tangible and intangible artifacts to an intuitive or internal system? So yeah, these are just questions I'm thinking about and just wanted to pose. This was interesting because it kind of it is a system of textile printing work, which is very well known, and it uses traditional visual canons, but it presents a completely new narrative, which is not the narrative from which this entire art form grew. So it's really the story, Bible stories represented here by the artist. And interesting that he uses the traditional visual canon to express how the story has to be read. This was a work at the Festival of India in the 70s. Is there another slide, Heather, to this section? Maybe not. Yes, this was again very interesting to me because, just like how we had botanists and biologists come into India during the whole colonial era, and begin to document, to understand, and to claim knowledge over an territory that was very alien and perhaps hostile initially. You find that craftsmen who typically would never have documented their work because they lived their patterns would have been printed on walls, they would have had blocks. You find that this documentation, which is really, to me, a spin-off from understanding how data was created and dispersed, this person has really mapped all the hundreds of designs that he or she, his craft studio did. And it's these intersections are quite interesting to look at what appropriations make sense for communities to pick up on and discard. So this was again from the same exhibition. Yeah.
Sally?
Yeah, this is interesting. And I just wanted to clarify with my last point. I wasn't saying that this couldn't be done. I'm wondering, like, what point can we reach to working within the frameworks that we are working in? Because there's no question, if we felt that it was an impossibility, we wouldn't be doing this work. We wouldn't be venturing or trying to forge ahead with certain paths of inquiry. The things that Nisha, you made an interesting point about these kinds of binaries, and how, this sort of distance, how do we collapse the distance between that and perhaps more intuitive ways of experiencing work? And I'm thinking about that, and I was thinking about things, I was thinking about different types of museums and different types of I guess, engagement through installations. And I was thinking about, I can't remember the artist's name, but I worked at a space many, many years ago. And before I started, there was an installation that was where an artist made this knitted work, and the artist wanted people to engage with the piece. And there was a woman who went into this space who was blind, who was experiencing this work and was enjoying it very much. And when the collections manager came upon this, she freaked out, right? And so I'm thinking about the ways in which, again, we assign value and we determine certain kinds of engagement. And I'm thinking about this in terms of historical artifacts. What happens when they're in the space of the museum and they're not activated through touch? They're only looked at. And this is a very sprawling sort of commentary that I'm offering here. But it's something that I come back to again, because I was thinking about what you were saying, Dakota, about consensus. And one of the questions that we had earlier on, and I guess it was something that you were sort of proposing and Heather was proposing, and I was sort of considering it because we're all here in the Americas. How do we take up frameworks of indigeneity? How do we implement them within the institution? What does that mean for someone like me who is not Indigenous? And so, like, how do you do that without cultural appropriation or without this kind of romanticizing that Nisha is referencing? And I think those are ways of moving forward and incorporating non-Western sort of ways of doing things into museum spaces. But then I'm also thinking about that and thinking about how we have these curatorial positions. I guess I'm just feeling contradictory today or something. Because I'm thinking about, like, we're assigned here, we're the one, we are the bearers of knowledge. Like, how do we kind of like, how do you, and that's something that I kind of struggle with, because I think people do romanticize the arts and they don't recognize that there is rigor that goes into these, that goes into the production of art for one, but also the people who hold these positions. And I think it's also interesting, when we talk about, Adrian Piper sort of observed this in the 70s, that whenever people who are marginalized start to gain more power, then we start sort of taking away, we make things, we remove them from their pedestals, which is both good and bad. So yeah, I don't really think that clarified anything, but those are the things that I'm thinking of, and I'm sorry, like, that I don't necessarily have slides to illustrate the work that I do, because this is something that I think about in terms of, how things are valued, what gets overlooked. I'm really interested in things that are overlooked, and in people like artists who have practices that utilize materials which are considered to be of low or no value until they are incorporated into a work of art. And thinking about how we're sort of moving forward in the work that we do at this particular moment when so many things are fraught.
Well, I feel like, Sally, one of the things that you're doing is setting us up really for our next question. So I'm going to go ahead and put the slide up. I'm thinking about some of the conversations. I mean, the four of us have had the privilege of really interrogating these ideas together and in conversation. And, you know, as I think about these, you know, what would be new hierarchies, what comes from this sort of critical thinking, and our conversation, I think, really reflects that. And, you know, these ideas of like binaries, which I think, unfortunately, I do believe in binaries, and I do think that there are some natural binaries in the world, but, you know, I think the idea of everything is too easily categorized as binaries, when it really is much more expansive than that and more complex than that. And forgive me, but like my grandfather would, you know, I'd be fussing about like not being this or that when I saw other people being this or that and doing it so gracefully, and I always felt so klutzy. And my grandfather, I remember one day telling me that, like, look out at all the trees, all these trees, you know, and he'd point out to the bodark and he'd say, that's a fairly small tree. It's not as strong as the oak tree. It can't grow as tall and as straight as the oak tree, but the bodark tree is the best one to make a bow out of, right? And the oak trees, like, they have these long roots and they can create shelter. And those, you know, those oak trees are really good for us to use to make homes with, but they don't have the flexibility that we need in other kinds of wood, and they're really hard to work with. And they don't provide the sort of protections that cedar trees do. And so, like, we all come with these gifts. And I think that this is the creator's like brilliance, right? That thing that we as humans just will never be able to do is to really do the complex work that the creator has done. But I think that there are ways for us to imagine, like, how can we facilitate a paradigm shift that allows for more embracive conversation around the value of the knowledge that our various cultures bring, right? Instead of thinking that one cultural paradigm is going to work for everything, let's think about how could we, if you're working with Asian art, why couldn't you be working with a paradigm that is centered around the cultures for which those objects were made, and out of the knowledge base that those, the philosophies that those were made. And so, like, what could be those rules of engagement? How can we use our ancestral knowledge? Our world, our global Indigenous world, has deep ancestral knowledge that is really quite profound and so often ignored, because it doesn't necessarily fit to those binaries. It doesn't fit to the boxes. So it feels to me like, could we make boxes that fit that knowledge and allow those boxes to be the things through which we then work with the various materials? And one of the things that Dakota has said before that I really appreciate and value is that, like, when we think about those kinds of diplomatic engagements amongst ourselves and trying to think what are the ways that we take, and Sally, I'm very sorry if it sounded dismissive. I realized I was responding to a part of the question, but not the whole of your question, which is, this is very complicated work, and there is not a single clear path forward. And I think it's also, you know, I think in some ways there's privilege that the four of us come to this work with, knowing that we've been on the outside of the work, right? Our communities have been on the outside, our cultures have been on the outside. And so we've been looking in and seeing it. Whereas some people who have been working within that belly of the beast, as you called it, and that their thinking fits that belly of the beast, well, they're probably even wondering, like, why are we even having this conversation? Like, it works for me. Why wouldn't we? If it works for me, why wouldn't it work for everything else? It's already being used, right? But I think that there is the potential of thinking about, like, cultivating a culture of generosity through museums that could facilitate us doing the work that we don't even know how or what will be needed, right? We're just believing in the same way that our ancestors could not 40 years ago have imagined us being in the positions we're in, carrying the privilege that we carry, that we have to believe that we can take one step forward or a couple of steps forward, or, you know, I feel like I'm running all day long to make whatever strides I can in the time that I have to do it. And as I'm doing that, you know, all of us, not just myself, but all of us are imagining what is the work that needs to be done. because those questions are not questions that have been asked. So I'm going to ask now, what's required for that? And what are the things that you see right in front of you that could be asked now? And what is needed to affect, fulfilling that imagined space? And I'd like to go ahead and toss this to Nisha first. And Nisha, you have a couple of slides, so I'll go to those.
Yes, thank you. Right. So, so I think that to me, reimagination calls for a revisualization, even amidst the assimilations that are bound to take place, the cross assimilations that we've been exposed to and adopt. So revisualization of geographies, terrain, and etc., which basically allows one to forge new understandings that previously, So I think that needs to be that's really at the core of that to me. The second is really that there is need to understand how communities, the preservation of the community or its arts via, or you could say resilience via its, how has, I think to really understand that as is important, in this question that we're asking about reimagining, because there is a way that communities have inherently, communities which have experienced this kind of extreme erasure of, and a disacknowledgement, if there's a word like that. And I wanted to give the example of Gandhi, who used a very powerful, it wasn't a work of art, but it was a very powerful symbol. And, other people from other countries have used symbols that they've worn as, and it becomes art. It's so powerful. And, the whole salt march or just weaving your own cloth or whatever it is. And I think that these become clues somehow. They become little keys in the whole, in the whole history of the community as it's represented. Yes, I've shown you this example before, representation of local material culture within the narrative, which needs to move to storytelling. One of the other points that we need to touch here is that in reimagination, the most obvious, the museum thing to do is to really, and the political thing to do is also to talk about repatriation. And I know that in some cases there have there are justifiable reasons why you need to do that. But, the other side of it is that we know also that in some cases there are very nebulous histories associated with these things. And the fact that if it hadn't been taken out of the country, we may never have seen that work. So I think it's complex, but needs to be addressed. And this image is, I'll end with this image, which is basically, when something is completely, sort of subverted, a way of previously discussing or showcasing or exhibiting work is subverted and thrown on its head, then it kind of gives rise to a lot of interesting meanings. And, I think that might be one of the things that critical analysis does, when we're investigating how to display work. This is, of course, a work by Lina Bobardi. And I think that right now in a world which is so, and it's happening all over the world, where there are these deep hate lines being drawn between communities and, through politics and all of that, I think that we as curators have a huge role to play to really, I think, bridge, whatever water has flown by, to bridge these gaps and to really reach out and to represent people as they would like to be, and for their stories to be told for the next generations. Thank you.
Sally, would you like to take a moment to think about that?
Do you mean take a moment to think about it before responding, or just?
No, I'm just, I guess, think out loud or to respond.
Think out loud?
Yeah, to the question in general. Would you like me to go back to the question?
No, I think I can respond it, and I'm going to respond in the way that I'm responding throughout the day today, which is to not have a clear response. I think part of me thinks that sometimes we imagine things, or we are working towards a goal and we have an end in sight, but the transformations that we're working towards, that we all, let's say for all intents and purposes, that we're all here, like even just the four of us here are working towards, maybe they don't actually look like what we're imagining, right? Like maybe we're experiencing some of that right now. And then the other thing that I'm thinking about, I'm going to say two more things, and then maybe I'll come back to sum them up, to tie them all together very neatly at the end, but maybe I won't. One is that, again, to sort of continue on with that train of thought, I think it's okay. I think it's okay that things are being repatriated. I mean, we have a lot of things documented. There are a lot of people, you were speaking about privilege, Heather. There are a lot of people who don't get to travel and go to museums, even if they're the museums that are close to the places where they live. So we can see, you know, before the days of curators having to travel to all of the biennials, we would see reproductions of things, or maybe you would travel infrequently to an art center. And I think it's okay that things are being repatriated to the communities and nations that have made them, and that not everyone has access to them. Because as Dakota alluded to, not everybody was supposed to have access to these things. Mm-hmm. And I what came into my mind was, I'm of like two minds about this, because obviously I work in institutions. I love objects. I like writing. Well, actually, I don't really like writing about art, but I like reading about art. Sometimes I like writing about art. So there's pleasure, there's learning that can be had within these spaces. But then I'm also thinking about this passage in Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon, where there's one character, and I can't remember her name, and she used to work for this really horrible, the character is a Black woman, and she worked for this horrible racist white family. And she, this is a really drastic example, so maybe I should like pull back from it a bit, but she, towards the end of the novel, she's living in this house while it's all decaying around her. And I think someone was asking her why she would want to be in that space. And I think it was like, so she could see this undoing. And I don't think it necessarily has to be like this negative thing, or we have to lament that these spaces are changing. As you alluded to, Heather, like these things are shifting and they kind of give way to other things. So I think maybe that's where our imagining is. Like we can take what we know and we can kind of let go a little bit and see where, not without some, not entirely without critical thought or without thinking, without being informed. But, you know, I think it's when we begin to loosen our grip, like all of us collectively, that's when things can really, new things can take root and open up.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it takes a certain release of power in order to allow for that good to come into the space. Dakota, I'm going to go ahead and go to your slide.
Oh,
slides.
Yeah. First of all, I want to say, like, I love how your mind is working, Sally, because it is complicated. And I like that, you know, you're like, well, I don't have a definitive answer. I'm here and here. But I mean, I think that's where we should be, because if we aren't like that, we can't, you know, we can't really see all of this situation from all of these different angles. So I really appreciate, actually, and I would say just all of these cohorts, how all of my cohort, how deeply each of these people is thinking about these issues. And I just think that's really important, that we we are all recognizing how complicated it is, and that there isn't really an easy answer to this. I guess when I'm looking at, how folks have been addressing this, I seem to have kind of some more nuts and bolts examples that are really tied to my personal practice and to the museum I'm working in right now. But what I wanted to say is that I think what is needed to be willing to, exactly what Sally's doing, flip that script or see that other side in the moment, that you're seeing it. And so the two examples that I have here, and you can even show the next one, is of how, when we were trying to reorganize our spaces for our install, we were going by this regional approach, but we just knew that was so problematic. In the fact, like, kind of to what Heather's saying, you have to have some kind of organization, but it was also problematic. And what do we do? And when we did that, we just tried to problematize that and to bring that into like the visitor awareness by saying, like, okay, like, we have used these designations, these location designations that were set up by anthropologists or whatever, but we also like left all these big gaps in between, because just to recognize that it wasn't as cut and dried, and it wasn't as like, okay, this was definitely the Northeast and Great Lakes region and nobody ever went out of there and all the artwork looks the same from there. We really wanted and to bring that, the porous nature of boundaries and of cultural exchanges and of the vast distances of trade routes and all the ways Indigenous people were inspired, to bring that into the consciousness of the visitor. And the way that we did that was to make like our walls and everything really porous and with these big gaps, so that from every place you stood in the gallery, you could see another section out of the corner of your eye, just to show that they weren't as cut and dried. And so that is like one example I have of how just recognizing, okay, this is a problem, but how can we challenge that? And how can we, bring that into the visitor's consciousness? And I think that the power of curators is that we sit at this place where we can, work with designers or whatever to reinforce, the points that we're trying to make. And let's see if I have any more. I think that's, the biggest example I've had of just like flipping the script and being willing to flip the script. So I guess I'll just leave it at that.
Well, I do think that there's an aspect of releasing the powers that have, emerged to what museums are today, and exploring what new hierarchies could come, what new categories might emerge. I know that's a discussion point that we've had before, has to do with the thinking through. And here I think it's actually a beautiful example, Dakota, of the power that painting has carried, within museums and within the collecting history, but also juxtaposed right across from, a child's dress and a horse adornment, and thinking through the fact that this conversation that's created through these within the space that is not necessarily, I love too the fact that you guys really effectively avoided like right angles and squared spaces and sort of shifting around paths. I mean, I think this image is a very good illustration that we have to do something. We have to be doing something as curators in our spaces and with the collections that we have, and recognizing that there will necessarily need to be a lot of experimentation and taking and accepting the potential risk for failure. I mean, I think one of the things right now that we don't discuss often enough is that, there is like in this critical social movement, there's a heightened attention to whether the story is being told, appropriately. Has a culture been appropriated and being, manipulated by someone else? And, all of those things are part of effectively within the work that we have as curators. But I think too, like, there's this aspect of we can't change it if we don't take some risks. And I wonder if each of you could maybe think about some of the risks that you have taken that, you know, you could speak to the value of it not being exactly what you imagined it would be, and allowing that you learn something from that. And I don't know if we've just got about 5 minutes, and if you each, you know, took a minute or so to speak to that, I don't know if anybody even wants to think about that, but or expose the failures. I can tell you, we did a lot right with our museum, but we've already got some things we're going to fix, you know. So I don't know, maybe that's not a good question, but
no, it's a great question. And I could just say really quickly, you know, I feel like our reinstall was a good success, and it achieved a lot of what we wanted to do, but there was risk that went into it, right? You know, like sometimes as an Indigenous person, standing your ground in these spaces is the risk that you're taking. And so I feel like, yeah, being willing to do that, I think that's the risk that I've been willing to take, and it doesn't come without some emotional, you know, pain and cost, and sometimes, you know, career pain and cost too. So that's, I mean, that's the change you know, you kind of have to be willing to take, but it's not always like the easiest road.
Sally or Nisha, do you have anything?
I was actually wanting to really pose a question to something that Dakota had mentioned earlier about high art. I mean, the value of something that's, let's say, produced by your community, which was high art in the community's eyes. How does one really recompose that value when you're showcasing this to a general public? You know, and what are the kind of things one can pull out? So it's just a question. I was mulling over that because that was a very interesting perspective, that each community looks at, you know, some of its artifacts as high art, which someone else is just saying that's just craft, you know. So how does one pull these things out to become very meaningful in the display of the object itself? But yeah.
I'll get back to you in 10 years from now when I got it all figured out.
Okay.
I feel like I'm grappling with that. I'm really grappling with that in my practice right now, and like developing that appreciation for those things. I would say it's there on some levels, but it's not there on other levels. So I don't have the answer to that, unfortunately, right now, but if I do figure it out, I'll let you know. It's tough to find that balance, I find, but maybe Heather has a different experience.
Sally, do you have anything you want to add here?
Well, I was going to respond to the earlier question, but I'll respond to this one here. It sounds like you're already doing that work, Dakota. When you bring things into a space, you're already elevating, you're already determining that this is worth looking at, this is worth considering, this is worth pondering. And when you bring them into dialogue with contemporary objects or things that we, you know, demarcate as fine art, you're also saying, well, this is art too, by virtue of its association with it. So I think, again, it's really interesting. This is kind of going back a little bit to Heather's question about taking risks. I was thinking the same things as you were voicing them, Dakota. Like, you do take risks when you put your foot down about certain things, when you push to show certain artists, or you push to install things in particular ways. But then if we think about all of our ancestors and what they have gone through, it's sort of like you're continuing that work, and maybe it mitigates some of the blowback that you might experience. but there was another point that I wanted to make. I think it was, again, with this idea that what we're doing doesn't necessarily, we're actually doing the thing, but it doesn't look like what we expect it to look like. And maybe, as you were saying, once you look back in 10 years, you'll be like, oh, I was doing that. I did do that. I was doing that all along. I just didn't realize it. So
I think that's absolutely true, Sally, that, you know, we only can just do what we can see in front of us in that moment. And while we have, like I always remind my team, we're thinking about the long game, right? We're thinking about the long game, the plans we can put into place now. And we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We can't just dismantle museums and hand it all back and start all over. So we have to make those shifts in small, subtle, hopefully meaningful, and shifts that have contribute to a longevity of shifting. You know, the biggest changes in the world are really not so much the ones that we feel like the earthquakes. It's the big changes come from the ongoing long, you know, production of the landscape. And I think that that's an absolute truth. I just want to say for myself, I do believe in the value of consensus. Our team works that way collaboratively and with consensus. We don't always agree. And I will say this, we always hold up that we need to be doing the very best that we can. And that means allowing that sometimes my ideas don't get done or someone else's ideas don't get done, but that we're thinking in the long game, what is the best moment decision we can make right now here with what we have, the tools we have, the knowledge we have, and the conditions that we have. And then believing that that simply has to be enough for this moment, knowing that it's not the only moment a decision will ever be made. And no exhibition is, you know, that's the one thing about curatorial work, right? No exhibition is is forever. It neither stands forever nor is remembered forever. So it's more like this, you know, the tides of the ocean slowly eroding and eroding. So I think these are all good comments, and, you know, and also that we're all making up what we're doing every single day with a certain amount of imagination and courage, and taking the risk that we need to in order to, you know, hopefully make those beneficial changes. I really want to just say thank you. It's been a very good conversation. Every time we get together, it's very profound thinking. And Dakota and Nisha and Sally, thank you so much for allowing me to share the conversation with you. I appreciate each of you for what you brought to the conversation. I want to thank our audience. There's quite a few of you who stayed with us through the whole thing. And like, even as we don't necessarily have answers to say, here's what needs to happen, we can see that something needs to happen. And we want to just thank all of you on behalf of the panelists, on behalf of myself. And I will hand it back over to Emma. Thank you, Emma, for helping us to be organized and get here.
Thank you all so much for such a wonderful webinar. This was just a highlight of my week, and working with all of you has been so wonderful. I just quickly wanted to step in and give a few more thank yous to everybody before we conclude. My name is Emma Hunick. I'm the program manager at AAMC and AAMC Foundation. Again, thank you to the panelists. They're all part of our Engagement for International Curators program. And I also would love to give a huge thank you to Terra Foundation for American Art, who has helped us to make this program possible. They're really amazing. I highly encourage that you check them out. And if you're interested in learning more about the Engagement for International Curators program, you can visit our website at artcurators.org. And if you're a curator and interested in applying to be a part of this program, the application cycle for 2023 actually opens this Saturday, October 15th, which is really excited. I'm sure everyone, all of our panelists can agree it's a really great experience. So keep an eye on our website and social media for the application link to go live. For more information. And of course, if you aren't a member of AAMC or not on our mailing list, I encourage you to visit our website for more information to learn more. So thank you all again for your time and joining us today, and